Switching gears a little bit, our next conversation involves someone I know you have read and seen on Fox News many, many, many times, Jonah Goldberg. Let me say this at the outset. Jonah is not simply America's best-known Star Trek fan. He is also an accomplished columnist and pundit, and of course the founder of National Review Online, which now boasts between 2 and 3 million visitors a month. He's a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and most importantly, a rare voice for clear thinking and intellectual honesty in a partisan public square. He has written many bestsellers, the most recent, The Tyranny of Cliches, How Liberals Cheat in the War of Ideas, and I'm sure he'll be talking to us a little bit more about that. But Jonah is the rarest of people. He is a public intellectual who actually works for freedom, for individualism, and for the liberation of Americans from, well, the public intellectuals. That takes honesty and courage both, and that's exactly the sort of man we want to hear from on the state of our country and what's next in 2013. He comes to us from the great American Northeast, but I would say he's a Texan at heart, maybe even a Texas Aggie at heart. So please help me welcome Jonah Goldberg. A special shout out to our sponsors. I know many of you are in the room. This is the most sponsors we've ever had. We will have raised almost $400,000 off of this event, but I want you to know that we use your funding very seriously. We take it very seriously. We want to be able to spend every penny wisely. So when Jonah agreed to come to Texas for a small fee, we said, that's great, but we actually need you to give 4 speeches. So, and he so very graciously agreed, so we're grateful for that. And joining Jonah on the stage is, of course, Josh Trevino, our Vice President of External Affairs. Josh, many of you know, one of the founders of RedState.com, an Army lieutenant, a former speechwriter in the Bush administration, a VP of policy at our sister group in California at the Pacific Research Institute, but he left as soon as he could, having been a native-born Texan, left as soon as he could from California to join us just a couple of years ago. Please help me welcome Josh Trevino and Jonah Goldberg.
Well, thank you all very much. Glad to see the mics on. It's always a good start to the conversation. Jonah, Brooke mentioned your role, which I think is, in my mind, your most important role. Now, your wife, child, and dog may disagree with this, but for me, your most important role is your role as an intellectual historian, which is rarely done well in American life. And those who do attempt it tend to be folks in sociology departments at colleges we would rather not exist. So I want to start with 2 quotes. The first quote is from Coleridge, the poet Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Those of you who know him probably know he's the author of Kubla Khan and the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. But as he descended into the madness that eventually claimed him, as with all good English romantics, he briefly founded a newspaper, which is also a sign of madness. And this newspaper ran for 25 issues and promptly folded, presaging the current state of journalism. But he had an essay in which he replied to Burke. Edmund Burke, one of the great conservative forebears, had a particular critique of governance. And Coleridge wrote this to Burke, quote, "It is bad policy to represent a political system as having no charm but for robbers and assassins, and no natural origin but in the brains of fools or madmen, when experience has proven that the great danger of the system consists in the peculiar fascination it is calculated to exert on noble and imaginative spirits, on all those who, in the amiable intoxication of youthful benevolence, are apt to mistake their own best virtues and choicest powers for the average qualities and attributes of the human character." Now, the second quote is from a gentleman by the name of President Barack Obama in 2008, quote, "We are the ones we've been waiting for. We're the change that we seek. We're the hope of those boys who have so little. Yes, they can." So my first question to you, with this in mind, is the state of discourse, and is the state of not just liberalism, but conservatism, is the excess and the dysfunction in American politics a function of perceived virtue?
They told me there'd be no Coleridge on this exam. Yes. I mean, look, we're in a particularly weird place historically, I think, in that we have never had a liberalism, we haven't had a liberalism this unapologetic about its stated assumptions about the world and the role of government since at least the 1930s. And that we are the ones we've been waiting for thing, which is another one of these sort of politics by way of Hallmark kind of statements that, it's like, it takes a village to raise a child and all that kind of thing, which, doesn't actually, these aren't actual real proverbs. But there is this sort of self-adulation that's built into the American character. We just had this survey that came out from Pew that found that today's college kids have the highest self-esteem of any young people in American history since they've been measuring it. They just think they're that great. And
they're about 80% above average.
Right, yeah, that's right. 80 to 90% of them are better than the arithmetic mean. And so you do have this situation where, for the first time, we have a critical mass of conservatives in this country who actually know what they believe and believe what they know. And you have a bunch of liberals who believe sort of equally dogmatically that just because they're liberal, they're right. And the difference, I think, between conservatives and liberals is that conservatives actually spend a lot of time talking. Conservatives, particularly conservative policy intellectuals, are geeks, right? We have ties with our favorite intellectuals. You go to Washington and you go to some of these think tanks, and you talk to young conservatives, and they're like members of a Dungeons and Dragons society. I'm a level 9 Hayekian. They get really deep into their ideas, and so we understand that we have a political philosophy. The problem with liberalism today is that it is so dogmatically bound up in the idea that just because they're liberals, that they're right. And they don't make appeals to political philosophy. They make appeals to feelings. I'm one of these guys who actually believes that liberalism is essentially what the philosopher Eric Vergelin called a political religion. It operates like a religion. You listen to liberals talk, they talk about testifying, right? I believe we should live in a country that does this. I believe that this shouldn't come at the expense of that. I don't want to leave any children behind, which is one of these phrases that George Bush picked up, which I never liked. Because frankly, I want to leave some children behind, particularly the ones who complain a lot. But
or the above average ones, at least.
Right, but there's this notion among liberalism that that they're essentially, whatever liberalism is for is definitionally the right thing. And that is a very difficult thing to argue against because it's not based in a political philosophy, it's not based in any serious economics, it's based in a feeling. And liberalism operates so much these days basically on feelings. And that's not a great way to run a government.
But is it plausible that it's based in one other thing, which is empirical outcomes? And by that, I don't mean Jonathan Chait style empirical outcomes that we love what's right and therefore we're on this side. But look, if you're looking at outcomes, let's say in the past year, the other side, if you are a Democrat left, for example, there's been a string of victories, and the GOP conservative side, on the national level, not talking Texas, but on the national level, has basically had a French-style battlefield performance. It is just racked up a string of defeats from the presidential election to the Senate elections, kept the House. And then the fiscal cliff deal, which is widely perceived as a defeat, the immigration issue, which is widely perceived as a defeat. So if you are on the other side, if you are with the White House and with the Democrats and with the left, does this approach lend itself to a unique political efficacy?
Well,
or is that momentary?
I think politics is always about moments. And I think one of the reasons why conservatives in particular these days are moping like a big dog whose food bowl's been moved is that we really thought that 2008 was a fluke. We thought that here was a guy, who was this charismatic, charming, maybe not by our lights, but by a lot of people's lights, African-American, first black president running against John McCain, who was not particularly popular with a significant portion of the GOP base. And people were very tired of, after 8 years of war and the Bush years and the partisan screaming, and here's this guy who ran as this post-partisan, transformative guy. He flew in here on a Pegasus promising to convert unicorn poop into renewable energy, and he was going to be this great guy. And then it turned out that it was sort of a con. And we thought, well, obviously this guy's going to lose his re-election. The economy is terrible. It's the worst it's been since, if not the 1930s, then since at least the 1970s. These policies, by our lights, have failed. I used to say under George W. Bush that Bush had spent money like a pimp with a week to live. But the money that we've spent under Obama has just blown that away. And so we just sort of thought, okay, this is a lock. And then all of a sudden Obama won. And it was deeply disheartening. And I doubt there's a conservative in the room that hasn't thought, either to themselves or doesn't nobody who said, well, that's it, I'm done. It's just, we've lost this country and all the rest. And so it's very easy to lose heart when you see the direction that the national politics are taking. But one of the reasons why you shouldn't lose heart is that so much about politics is about personalities and about moments. And historically, it's very, 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 very rare for an incumbent presidential the party that holds the White House for 8 years to win a third term. It just doesn't happen very much. And I know that Joe Biden is thinking about running for president, which, as a pundit, I want to send him a basket of muffins. Because I just think that would be so exciting and wonderful. And our bench right now, as Bill Bennett was saying earlier on the radio, our bench, which was a little too green in 2008, the Rubios, the Ryans, the Jindals, these guys are now in the field. And my sense is, and it's just a sense, is that Obama's machine and popularity does not transfer to the next generic Democrat. That said, the GOP really does have serious problems. Mitt Romney, we talked about this a bit yesterday, Mitt Romney was not an ideal candidate. I don't want to bash on him because he worked so hard, his heart was in the right place, he's an honorable man who would have made a better president, the country made a mistake not electing him. But if you were to do this in retrospect, if you just look back on it, a guy who was, there's something about Massachusetts governors that they should just, let's just not look at them for presidential candidates, right, from either party. But this guy who was a Wall Street investment banker, was the exact wrong image for the Republican Party to be running this time around. And Mitt Romney had a very difficult time connecting with people. As I said yesterday, the guy has an authentic inauthenticity problem. He just sort of seems fake. And he looks like the picture that comes with the frame. And the idea that somehow the GOP's problems are permanent leaves out the fact that we had specific personalities running, and those personalities aren't going to be around the next time around. But personally, I think one of the things that the GOP really needs to do is work on this brand problem. And I hate the word brand and branding and all the rest, but it's the word that we use for this, is that right now the GOP is the party at the national level, and certainly among young people, of really judgmental buzzkills who want to get rid of the minimum wage and want to not pay any taxes. Now, I want to get rid of the minimum wage, and I don't want to pay any taxes, but it's not a great look. And one of the things I think the GOP really needs to do is figure out a way, following to some extent the kind of policies that you guys do here at TPPF, of sort of cutting this Gordian knot. And the way you do that is through federalism. Federalism is the best system ever conceived of for maximizing human happiness. It allows the most people to live the way they want to live. And the way for the GOP to seem less sort of Comstockish and judgmental and stuffy is to simply say, hey, look, California, if you want to take the express route to hell, go for it. But if South Carolina wants to go a different way, or if Texas wants to go a different way, go for it too. It's not our business. This is the way you satisfy this tension between conservatism and libertarianism. Because one of the tenets of libertarianism, properly understood, is the right to live conservatively. And the wonderful thing about libertarianism, about federalism, is that if you push the issues down to the lowest local level possible, lowest democratic level possible, you have the benefit of having the people who are affected by the law, having to look the people who want to pass the law in the eye. You see them at the store. You see them at your PTA meeting. The problem we have with national politics now is you have one set of sincere conservatives of the sort of John Ashcroft type who want to impose one vision on the entire country, and you have another set of liberals of the Barbra Streisand type that want to impose one vision for the entire country. And if I have to choose between those two, I'm going to go with Ashcroft. But I don't think we should have to choose. Let people live the way they want to live. And if you lose those fights at the local level, you have two options. Live to fight another day, or move. It's the most mobile country in the history of the world. And if you really just don't want to live in a kind of town or community that does things a certain way, go find some place where you'll feel welcome. And that works for both liberals and conservatives. But if you push this stuff down to the most local level possible and get Washington out of it, you cut through a lot of these incredibly infuriating debates that are basically angels on the head of a pin debates about what is the perfect society. We're never going to have a perfect society. The federal government can't impose one, but you can have a good society. And the communities that you live in are the actual only communities that exist. You know, Barack Obama and Bill Clinton at the Democratic Convention, they kept talking about how we're all in it together. That's the politics they want to impose. You can't have that for a country of 320 million people. You know, you can have it all, we're all in it together attitude at the local level, but if you have it at the federal level, what you end up doing is imposing your vision in a tyrannical or oppressive way on people who disagree with you about how they want to live. And so that's what I think the GOP really needs to do, is, you know, focus on the things that the federal government is actually for, you know, an army, collecting taxes, rule of law, foreign policy, a few other things, and then push everything else to the most local level possible. And a few things are going to bubble up as federal issues, and that's fine, and we'll debate those. But err on the side of letting people live the way they want to live.
You know, when we talk about the Republican Party, though, we're really talking about two parties right now. We're talking about one party that at the national level has not made the sale in the past couple of years, has lost a presidential election, has lost several Senate elections, has barely held on to the House of Representatives. And that party is in terrible straits, the National Party. But when we talk about the GOP as a series of state parties, they're doing fantastic.
Yeah.
32 state houses, I believe, and not just governorships, but governorships, state senates, state legislatures. So at the state level, and then when you think of our bench as well for 2016, you are mostly, not exclusively, but you're mostly talking about governors.
Right.
When people compile their wish lists. Yesterday, and the takeaway, I advocated, half as a joke, but the more that I think about it, I think it's a great idea, abolish the RNC and let the Republican Governors Association run the show. How do you draw the line, and how do you make the connection between what's going so right at the state level for the Republicans and what's going so wrong at the national?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one of those reasons why you shouldn't despair too much, because up until very recently, the rule of thumb was that governors win presidential races, not senators. I mean, we hadn't, until Barack Obama, we hadn't elected a senator from the Senate since 1960.
Yeah.
Right? And it wasn't all that common before that. In part because there's something about the Senate that, you know, not to use indelicate language, but sort of gelds you.
It's the world's greatest deliberative body.
But, you know, I remember Orrin Hatch, when he was running for president, he had this great line where he says, "You want to talk about leadership? You want to talk about leadership? I co-sponsored the bipartisan resolution to move that legislation out of committee onto the floor." And it just doesn't sound like leadership to normal Americans, you know? And I think that, you know, the governors, where a lot of the real policy work is done, are this great resource that you're going to see bubble up through the system in 2016 and 2020 and beyond. I agree that there's a problem with, that is a bipartisan problem, that we have been moving too much of our understanding about what government does to the federal level, and that makes the RNC more important, because it is basically the national party. But it's also worth pointing out that one of the problems that we have in this country, everyone talks about how terrible partisanship is and all the rest. One of the problems we have is that the parties are too weak, not that they're too strong. You know, anybody who runs for president and gets the nomination automatically is the Republican Party. And but beyond that, when there's no Republican president, the RNC is basically just this sort of paper tiger thing that has no ability to whip its members. It has no ability to impose discipline on its members. It's a PR operation. And the same thing sort of goes with the House of Representatives and the Senate. The institutional power of the Speaker of the House is so much less than it was even 10 years ago. I mean, and I was in favor, and I'm beginning to rethink it a little bit, the whole earmark thing. Because one of the things that gave the Speaker power to whip his people into line was the ability to dole out, these treats for bridges and whatnot. And without that, there's very little incentive that a rank and file guy has to do what the Speaker wants or do what the Senate Majority Leader wants. And there are good aspects to that, but there's also bad aspects to that, because it just means that the whole operation looks pretty amateurish, because everyone's running around in their own direction, running on their own agendas. And if there was a way to impose a little more party discipline, it might be a healthy thing.
Let's move into a bit of forecasting. Pardon me. Is it time for Q&A? All right. Wait, that will be the first question. Is it time for Q&A? Okay. Very good. Jonah.
Yes.
Is it time for Q&A?
You're running this show.
Very good.
I can't remember. This is my fourth or fifth speech for you guys.
Well, let me ask one question. Then we'll move to audience Q&A because I do want to get into a tiny bit of forecasting. It appears from all indications, from explicit statements from the White House that the agenda for the spring is going to involve the White House rationally pushing what it perceives as its advantage on some hitherto fairly contentious issues, and issues, honestly, that the Republican side has in the past won on. So we're shortly going to have a fight on immigration. We're shortly going to have the debt ceiling fight. And we're shortly going to have, apparently, some manner of gun control fight. What do you make of this, and will they win?
The definition of win depends. I think they lose. I mean, if the question is, are they going to move, say, gun control legislation through the Congress? The answer is no. There may be some, absolutely ineffective and kind of ridiculous thing that makes it through on gun control.
We may finally free our inner cities of the bayonet at last.
You just look at the record of Democrats in the House and in the Senate on gun control, and there just aren't the votes there, which is one of the reasons why Joe Biden said yesterday that they might look at it through executive orders. And there's no stopping him on executive orders, but technically on executive orders, you're not allowed to invent laws through executive order.
Though they have very recently with the DREAM.
I said technically.
Technically, yes, okay. Right.
You can only change how you implement enforcement. But even there, look, the blowback on all of that, and it's amazing, despite the absolute horror in Newtown, and I must say, I did not like on the right or the left the immediate retreat to our corners to hash out our talking points about guns and gun control and all the rest. Let them bury the dead. I mean, I so resented being forced to argue about it. I thought it was disgusting the way Democrats exploited the issue and so quickly for political gain. And I was sort of disgusted with the way some sort of gun rights enthusiasts took this opportunity to celebrate how wonderful guns are. And I more agree with the gun rights guys by far than the other side. But just shut up for a minute and let them bury the dead and mourn. It was so terrible. And maybe I say that because I've got a little kid, but it was just so terrible. That said, on immigration, I think that we will see something. We talked about it a little bit last night. I think that what we get out of it could be fraught with peril, because what you don't want to see is basically the Democrats just continuing this policy mess for another generation that benefits them. When people ask me what my preferred policy is on immigration, my preferred policy is to have a policy. I'm pretty generous about immigration. I love immigration. It drives me batty that Republicans are on the wrong side of the immigration narrative. People swimming, across the Rio Grande, or as my father-in-law did. My father-in-law, when he was 16 years old, swam the Danube to escape the communists, and came to this country and became a huge success. I love those stories, and that is a Republican conservative story. By your own bootstraps, carving something out with your own bare hands, carving a success out of life to have a better life for you and your family. That is the Republican conservative story. And how somehow Republicans got on the wrong side of that drives me crazy. That said, if you're going to have a policy, you have to have a policy. And if the policy is to have 3 million immigrants a year, then it has to be 3 million immigrants a year, and not 3 million and 1, not 3 million and 2, not 10 million. Pick a policy and enforce it, and I'm with you. And I think that and Josh is better to talk about this than I am, but I think what the Democrats want to do is basically just do exactly what we did the last time around, have this amnesty about the people who already voted Democratic, and not do anything about stopping the cycle from repeating itself and another wave of illegal immigrants coming in that they can then promise amnesty to, without actually figuring out a way to sort of have a rational labor market that allows for people to cross the border and maybe go home and all of the rest. But I think we'll get something about that, in part because I think Republicans are legitimately chastened about the changing demographics of the country. And the problem is that they are not sufficiently intellectually coherent on this to stand up to the Democrats and say, you're right, we have to do something about immigration, but your way is the wrong way. And that's one of the things I think that you guys and other groups like this can help by actually giving the Republicans a serious alternative to the Democratic approach that isn't simply sort of covering our ears and saying we're not going to do anything about immigration.
Very good. Shall we go to audience questions? And I see a gentleman's hand right back in the middle there, and then you, sir, will be second up front.
Jonah, when you talk about partisanship and policy, a question, when we look at the fight that's going on in Washington, once you get past Ted Cruz and Mike Lee and a few other conservatives, is there any stomach on the Republican side to actually reduce spending, to actually stop the growth, or they just want to slow the growth and let the Leviathan keep going, just not get as fat as quickly?
I think there is real stomach for it. I mean, I really do. You talk to certainly the class that came in 2010, that Tea Party class, they really want to do it. The problem is, first of all, to be honest about it, there are lots and lots of Americans, particularly in red states, people who vote Republican, who don't want their entitlements cut. They just don't. The country is in a very precarious place because we are in effect bribing large numbers of people to be in favor of unsustainable government. And one of the brilliant things that the progressives did was rig the system so that a increase in spending that is 2% lower than last year, but still an increase, is counted as a cut, which is just batty. But I think, Jim DeMint is very good on this stuff, and I hope he has some effect when he moves to the Heritage Foundation. The problem that we have now is that the definition of compromise is Democrats say we need to go at 70 miles an hour over a cliff. And they want the Republicans to, the definition of compromise is they want to go over 70 miles an hour over a cliff, and they'll say they'll compromise with the Republicans and only go over the cliff at 35 miles an hour. And the Republican point is, no, we need to turn around and drive away from the cliff, and then we'll compromise about how fast we want to go in the right direction. And so I'm all in favor of compromise, but I want to compromise about how much we cut, not how much more we spend. And the problem is that it is so rigged into the language of the media, so rigged into the language of government, that it's very difficult to make that point. But it's got to change. I mean, it's simple. I mean, that's the one, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play kind of upside to all of this, is that this is simply unsustainable. Flat out unsustainable. You could confiscate the wealth of the entire 2% and it delays the problem for a little while, and not very long. As Margaret Thatcher always used to say, the problem with socialism is eventually you run out of other people's money. And so eventually this is just going to have to be dealt with. And the question is whether we deal with it as a matter of sanity and sobriety, or we deal with it in the middle of a bond vigilante crisis that, you know, the country goes over a cliff. But the Republicans understand that. It's persuading the other guys that's the problem. You can't do a lot just when you only control the House of Representatives. You just can't.
Yes, sir. Next question, and then you're next.
You made the comment that we have a green bench, the Republicans, and that politics is all about personalities and moments. It is about feelings and getting your idea across to the masses. Who are the individuals that are on that green bench that could be the Ronald Reagans and communicate with the masses what the real issues are about in a feeling way?
Yeah. I mean, just to be clear, I also think politics is about ideas. I mean, that's what I spend my days concerned with, is ideas. But politics needs also to be about making connections with people and persuasion. And that's one of the problems. That's one of the things I think a lot of conservatives have lost, is that there's this quest simply for purity. You know, if our guys were just stood on principle more, we would win everything. When at the end of the day, if you're not persuading people who disagree with you, you lose. That is what politics is about. And I love Ronald Reagan. I'll take a backseat to nobody. I have a full-blown man crush on Ronald Reagan. Great guy. But he was a great president, not just because of his ideas, but because he was an unbelievably charming politician. And, you know, what Bill Bennett likes to say, the Irish definition of charm is eliciting a yes before you even have to ask the question. And we need to concentrate a lot more on promoting politicians who have the right principles, but are also just good politicians. And, you know, in that group, I think Paul Ryan is still a very good politician. People forget that his district votes Democrat every single time, and yet he wins decisively. I think Ted Cruz, I know he's a friend of your guys, but he's also been a longtime friend of National Review, has real potential. He's still green. I mean, he's just getting there now. He's trying to figure out where the men's room is. You know, Bobby Jindal did very badly when he did his response to the State of the Union, but I think he's the first governor to be reelected in Louisiana since Huey Long, and for a little 90-pound Indian dude, policy wonk, to be able to get, you know, those guys in rural Louisiana to vote for him says something. That's an impressive thing, and I just wish he could show it a little better at the national level. I gotta say, Jeb Bush is easily one of, you know, he was the best Republican governor. He was the best governor in the country when he was the governor of Florida. Very impressive guy, left with enormous approval ratings in a very diverse state. If he could just change his last name, you know, to Gretnick, he would do great, you know. Rubio, you know, I think is an obvious talent. So these are good guys, but they got to keep working at it a little while. Personally, I'm a big fan of Haley Barbour's. I love that routine. But you know, one of the things that Mitt Romney showed is that simply being qualified for the job isn't enough. You need to look authentic when you're eating a corn dog at the county fair. And for all the grief I gave George W. Bush, he was a good politician. And for all the, you know, George Bush was not, I've said it before, I'll say it in Texas too. George Bush was not a great extemporaneous public speaker, right? He just simply was not. When you listen to George Bush, you know that feeling you get when you're walking down a flight of stairs in the dark and you miss a step? And you're like, oh my God, where's this going to land? That's how you felt listening to some of his sentences. You know, it's like, where is this thing going to end up? And then he would stick the landing and you were just so relieved that he made it that you lost paying attention. But it turns out that George Bush was a much better communicator in a lot of ways than Mitt Romney was. Because at least you knew viscerally you knew where George Bush was coming from. Mitt Romney parroted bad Republican talking points badly. That's what that 47% thing was. And so there's a problem that we have in the GOP with followership. We don't trust our leaders. We don't trust the Republicans. often for very good reasons, because we've been screwed a lot. But there's no way these guys are going to be able to play the strategic game well if we don't trust them a little bit on the tactical game. And there was no good outcome for the fiscal cliff, and the right thing would have been to do to surrender early and declare victory. We have made the Bush tax cuts permanent for 98% of the American people. Hooray! And then walk away and just beat the hell out of Obama on spending. Instead, we orchestrated that thing perfectly to look like a failure at every step of the way.
Okay. Sir, do you have a question? Oh, I'm sorry. There we go.
I do. As a fairly old guy in this room, it's been a long time, I guess, more than 30 some odd years, since I have felt that this country was really optimistic. Reagan made us feel optimistic when, the Cold War is over.
Yep.
Where are we going to go? It's optimism that got us on a great path. And then something has happened. And now all we hear, well, we got to fight this, we got to fight that, we got to beat this, the optimism seems to be gone from the discourse that we have in this country. You go on television, everybody wants to yell at the other person, and I'm not sure that we're ever going to be able to turn that around, and that bothers me. I just wonder what your thoughts might be on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some truth to that. And I think that, part of the problem, there was a wonderful essay by Jay Cost in a magazine called National Affairs called The Politics of Loss. And he said politics are destined, part of his argument is that politics are destined to get ugly and stay ugly for a long time. For the simple reason that when you had the sort of runaway economic growth that this country saw after World War II, up until basically the 1980s, with obviously the exception of some of the 70s, politics could be about both and, rather than either or. The Republicans could get what they wanted, and the Democrats could get what they wanted. You could pay for the programs that you wanted or the tax cuts that you wanted by giving the tax cuts or the spending that they wanted. Now, in a time of fiscal discipline, necessary fiscal discipline, you can't do that. That it's becoming more zero-sum. That my loss is your gain and your gain is my loss. And that, by definition, is going to make politics uglier. I also think the narrative about the Obama presidency is so completely wrong. People forget that this guy came into office with 70% public approval. Republicans were so ready to work with him on that stimulus. And I know Republican operatives who were terrified that Obama was going to give them half a loaf or a third of a loaf on the stimulus. And everyone talks about Obamacare as what poisoned the Obama presidency. It was the stimulus, because they got so greedy and decided to basically pay off state governments, municipal unions, government unions, the green energy boondoggle, and all of that they didn't even really have a stimulus. Because look, even conservatives normally will agree that you can be the biggest Milton Friedman fan in the world, but normal conservatives will agree that if you drop $1 trillion of spending on the country, you'll at least get a sugar rush. And we didn't even get that. And what the stimulus did was that it proved to the Republicans that this guy, all of that talk about bipartisanship, all that talk about reaching out to the other guy was bogus. And it poisoned the presidency. And the Republicans learned from that you can oppose Obama and gain from it politically. Because they didn't know that you could do that. And it also proved that you could roll Obama. Look, if you had screwed LBJ on the signature piece of legislation at the beginning of his administration, like the Republicans did on the stimulus, you would wake up the next morning with your favorite horse's head in your bed. And so Obama talked this great game about unity and bipartisanship and all of that, and the reality is that that was all a cover for a very partisan way of governing. And the Republicans responded in kind. And I know it's a juvenile argument to say they started it, but they really did this time. And when you have Obama having these grandiose ambitions and giving people good reason to believe that it really is this European social democrat, which is, social democrat is a polite way of saying socialist. They are synonymous terms. And it's amazing, you talk to the left and you say, I think he's a socialist. And they'll say, no, he's just a social democrat. Which is like saying, I think it's 12. And you say, no, it's just the sum of 6 plus 6. I mean, the same thing. He's completely eroded any trust. And the next 4 years are going to be hammer and tongs going forward. And I don't think there's any way to get around it. It's lamentable, but it's the reality. But it's not permanent.
Yes, sir.
Earlier, you kind of hinted at the split or disconnect between the National Republican Party and the Republican Party at state levels across the entire country. Some couple really obvious examples of that. In 2010, when Harry Reid got reelected, Brian Sandoval was elected governor of Nevada by double digits. In this past election, North Dakota reelected their Republican governor, sent a Democrat to the U.S. Senate. Why do people seem happy to send Democrats to Washington but want Republicans to lead their states? And why did Obama win all of those states in the upper Midwest that elected Republican governors in 2010?
I think they're for all related reasons. At the state level, people somewhat wrongheadedly have this sense that what the state government does is about my money. And what the federal government does is about somebody else's money. And so they want to be better stewards about how they run their actual communities than how they run the federal government. And I think that's a big part of it. They trust Republicans to run to hold the purse strings locally. But there's a second problem, is that at the federal level, the federal government, since the age of Woodrow Wilson, and I'm a resolute Woodrow Wilson basher, has been ever more about our vision for the country, right? Woodrow Wilson's the first president to talk about how the president needs a vision. And the problem with that, and now it's a bipartisan thing, Republicans and Democrats alike talk about vision, but the problem with vision is that it means you're basically trying to impose your conception of what America should be like on America. And that is now written into our DNA about how we view the federal government. And so much about what we vote for at the federal level is aspirational, it's poetic, it's metaphorical, it's quasi-religious, and it's not tethered to our understanding about dollars and cents in the same way as it is at the local level. And that's a real problem. But it's also a rational thing, right? When the average Medicare recipient pays in $140,000 over their lifetime and gets out $340,000, they think that's a pretty good deal, and because they're rational human beings. And that understanding of what the federal government does has sort of poisoned our politics to a certain extent. And it's why the Republican Party has such a problem at the federal level, because the Republican Party tries to talk like the state Republican parties about balanced budgets and fiscal responsibility, when so many Americans don't have that expectation of the federal government anymore. They think the federal government is a mixture of Baal and Santa Claus and God. And so they want to send people to the federal government that fulfill their innermost aspirations about what government can do and what a wonderful country we can live in, rather than saying, these are just the guys who are going to work with our tax dollars. And if you're not paying very much in federal taxes, which a lot of people are not, it becomes ever more easy to sort of have this disconnect because they're not working with your money.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have good news and bad news, and as befits the season we just had, I will start with the bad news, but then transition to the good. The bad news is that our time with Jonah Goldberg is over, so please join me in giving him a round of applause. Jonah, thank you so much.
Sure, thank you.
For your insight and your wit, and really for dealing with the people in New York so we don't have to. So thank you for that. Now, the good news is that we have lots and lots and lots of informative and exciting panels that are beginning. So I urge you to go forth and attend them, and we look forward to seeing you back here very, very soon. Thanks for coming.